Eccoci quindi giunti al momento topico per quello che riguarda il dibattito in lingua inglese. Siamo alla presenza delle due squadre finaliste che sono il Fermi Monticelli di Brindisi, che rappresenterà la posizione contro, e il Galilei di Pescara, che rappresenta invece ovviamente il pro. Ora vi tocca una cosa terribile, cioè io dovrei pronunciare un titolo in inglese che non so, e quindi ridete già prima tranquillamente. Vediamo, ci provo, ma non capirete niente. This house will introduce a global carbon tax, una roba meravigliosa. A questo punto credo che andiamo, io lascio il microfono, immagino, a loro perché non ce l'hanno. Ragazzi, state tranquilli, al massimo arrivate secondi, che è bellissimo. Va bene, in bocca al lupo, un grande applauso a loro.
È acceso. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Today's debate is not purely academic. Our heart, our very world we live in, is threatened every second by environmental destruction. The United Nations annual report has confirmed that fossil fuels are by far the largest contributor to global warming, accounting for over 90% of all carbon dioxide emissions. As Bloomberg News has already announced, 83 million people are likely to die from climate change in the next 80 years. This is why this House would introduce a global carbon tax. A carbon tax is a fee imposed on the burning of carbon-based fuels, and those exact fuels that, as we have stated, are responsible for the global warming. How would this trust function? They would be introduced by the World Trade Organization that would set a price that emitters must pay for each ton of greenhouse gas emissions that they emit. The objective is to reduce greenhouse emissions and promote environment-friendly processes. If set high enough, it makes polluting fuels, products, and services more expensive than cleaner alternatives such as solar energy. Therefore, the emitters will be strongly incentivized to produce lower levels of emissions and turn to alternatives that are greener. Moreover, with the money gathered with the tax, the World Trade Organization would subsidize new green technology itself. But that is not all. The World Trade Organization office would, yes, redistribute the tax by founding reasonings that those countries haven't polluted until now because they did not produce as much as developing countries. So the undeveloped countries, the developing countries, are the ones that would actually have a benefit too. Those poor countries will in fact receive more investments than what they pay with the tax, so that there would be a redistribution of wealth around the world. We talk about a global carbon tax, and we mean a carbon tax leveled across all countries and internally. We have four main major points. Who would control it? The World Trade Organization. Why countries would comply? Because simply 194 states have already submitted the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement relies on so-called peer pressure to force countries to comply with climate change plans. At COP26, prominent world leaders have publicly shamed nations that have failed to clearly state their strategies. public image and possible damage to public relations are powerful tools that can force countries to comply. Public image also influences the internal economy, so governments are actually interested in keeping a clean image. Yeah.
Are you aware that the World Trade Organization is part of the ONU, so it doesn't collect all the countries from all around the world, as you're saying?
It is the most complete organization that we have because it includes the most countries around the world, and there is still the possibility for more countries to get in it. So, going on, did it work somewhere globally? Yes, locally, sorry. Yes, British Columbia has decreased by 17% their emissions in just a few years. And many other countries which have applied a global carbon tax had positive results without a decrease in their GDP. Another very important point in our model is why it should be global. And it is for three prime reasons. The first one is countries' inertia or weak climate plans. Many countries have not applied a carbon tax and neither have opted for weaker methods that clearly have not yielded significant results. A global carbon tax would shift away from this inefficient approach by requiring all countries to introduce a carbon tax globally. The second is the risk of carbon leakage. So countries that are developed could move to other countries, the developing countries, but if the carbon tax is global, we do not have that risk anymore. And the third one, no thank you, is the reduction of the fear of loss of competitiveness. So many countries have been reluctant because they would have thought that they would have been damaged by this carbon tax. But if it is global, that is not the risk anymore. As we said, we are all on the same boat, and even the developing countries would have a major benefit from it. Why? Because poor developing countries are responsible for a small percentage of global emissions. So, for example, South America accounts for only 3% of CO2 emissions, and the entire African continent for not even 4%. We must remember that the contribution to climate change does not depend on where in the world it occurs, so it has to be global. At COP27, data was produced to indicate that the developing countries are the most exposed to climate change risks. The lowest income the countries produce on 1/10 of emissions, but are the most heavily impacted by climate change. Therefore, the benefits of a global carbon tax for these countries would outweigh any other cost. So, according to the World Bank, in sub-Saharan Africa, only South Africa has implemented a carbon tax. It is being considered by Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal. We believe that a global carbon tax would be beneficial to poorer developing countries because, firstly, it would prevent them from useless investments and lock-in effects. So according to IFS economic experts, without international carbon pricing, and in particular a carbon tax now, companies in developing countries will probably make investments in high carbon technologies that will only end up being wasted later on. An example would be power companies in these countries that today are investing in non-green power plants that will end up having to either discard them or be locked into a higher emission pathway over the medium term. For the developing countries to have this global carbon tax. Going on to our arguments, we believe that the only actual way to achieve this goal is through a global carbon tax for three main reasons. It reaches the goal set by COP26 and 27, it pushes forward green technologies, and it would have a persuasion domino effect. So, the global carbon tax is the most effective measure because it would reduce the global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. The first principle of economics is that people respond to incentives, and a carbon tax is the embodiment of the incentives, said Mansky and Frank, who represent the great majority of economists. A carbon tax set high enough will make present fuel burning procedures more expensive for industries and businesses, and therefore will be forced by the mechanisms of market to change their behavior. Right now, these costs are more expensive, but a carbon tax will change this. So, And even if the cost of this tax is typically passed down to consumers with higher bills, as a consequence, consumers will reduce their consumption. So we have to be careful with the usage, but the global carbon tax would actually be beneficial. So considering all of these facts, I am sure that everyone in this room will agree that a global carbon tax is the most effective choice. And this is why I'm so very proud to propose.
Speaker. Your time was 8 minutes and 14 seconds for the first speaker of the opposition side.
I'm going to start my Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Good morning, everyone, dear judges, proposition team, and dear audience. I'm Alessandra Farina, and today we're debating about introducing or not a global carbon tax. I'll divide my speech in 2 parts. First, I'm going to refutate what the other team has said, and then I'm going to present you our proposal about the matter. Starting with the refutation. So you presented a tax that would be applied thanks to the WTO. So you also present a general taxation because, as you stated, and we agree, we are in a very urgent situations for global solutions to improve a real actual problem. But you presented a model in which, first of all, you didn't define how the taxation is going to be actually in numbers. You didn't say if it's going to be equal for everybody or different. And if it's going to be different, the taxation will bring many issues like free riding, or so countries would actually present competitive products more than the others. So it's important to actually see how this taxation will present many issues. And also, you talked about the concept of compensations for countries, for developing countries. This is the loss and damage themes that I'm going to actually present in my argument. But you mentioned the Paris Agreement. Actually, in the Paris Agreement, USA actually back off with President Trump. This shows that these agreements are just a suggestion. They are not an imposition. So they're not going to be as effective as we need to. So if a country can back off, why should everybody keep staying in that way? And also, you are talking about money through a tax, and then this money will be given back. But why, as a company, I should change direction if I pay you and you give back my money? So moving on with our point of view, as I said, the scientists demand a drastic change. But the difficulty is decisive for global carbon tax require unanimity. And this is not possible, and we're going to show you why. First of all, comparing to the net neutrality zero goal. So it's very hard to actually choose just a date to set this goal. For example, countries like China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia push the limit from 2050 to 2060, and India pushed the limit to 2070. So they are not even agreeing on a date. And also there is the problem of climate justice, because the responsibilities and costs, as I'm going to show you, will not be completely covered. And then the carbon tax does not address the issue of fixing the amount of emissions. So it's not good for us in the short term, because we are not actually stopping emissions. So our team instead argues that the introduction of a global carbon tax is yes.
So do you understand, however, that if a company or a country has to pay in order to have these emissions, that means there will be an economic loss, thus they will not be inclined to do so?
Thank you for your question. You said that this money will go back to companies to change to a green direction. So actually it's not going to change very quickly. And you said that the situation is drastic. So we do not have time to do that. As I was saying, our team argued that a global carbon tax is a solution impossible to apply in the short term, not sustainable for many national countries, and ineffective with the net zero emissions goal. So instead, we propose a control model or an integrated and hybrid system, which starts from the effectiveness demonstrated by the European emission trade system, improved with the system of banking and emission permits, with local integration of border and carbon tax adjustment to solve the risk that you said of carbon leakage. So we're going to show you the limits and the cost of a global carbon tax and actually the effectiveness of our solution, so an integrated cap and trade. We're going to do that with three main arguments. I'm going to present tax due to diversity of interest and conditions. The second speaker will present to you the two other arguments. So a global carbon tax is not sustainable for national economies on taxpayers in numbers and social acceptability. And the other argument, the application of a global carbon tax does not set certain emission target. That is our main problem. So starting with my argument, I said that two different are the economic interests of the countries already involved in the climate accords like the Paris Agreement that is not working because of big polluting countries like USA back off. So a global carbon tax should agree on rates, taxable amount, and how deposits are used. As we said, they're not even agreeing on a date. So how we can think they will agree on all those things? And there is the problem of loss and damage that I mentioned before. What is loss and damage? It's a potential negative impact in particularly vulnerable in particularly vulnerable developing countries. So there is a lack of official definition on this problem since the 90s, just on the definition. Because there is the problem of compensation. There are developing and developed countries that has two different interpretations. For the developing countries, they are the most vulnerable, loss and damage would be a policy to have a compensatory mechanism, while the developed countries have challenged this interpretation to have strongly opposed for compensation and assumption of responsibility. So we see that not even COP27, that is the most recent one, there is a clear definition of loss and damage. No, thank you. Loss and damage. So countries, it's very hard to have unanimity as a set, especially with these geopolitical problems. Since the Kyoto agreements, they are the first one being made about the climate, it has been more feasible to opt for a cap and trade system because it does not require unanimity. That, as I said, is a big problem. So what is cap and trade? We are talking about cap and trade. No, thank you. We're talking about cap and trade, especially in its application in Europe with the emission trading scheme. Cap is a number of allowances, so of permissions of polluting that can be emitted, can be sold or purchased in a market. So this has two advantages. First of all, we set a sure maximum level of emissions that will be reduced over time. Why? Because the government will reduce the allowances available to companies. So it's going to be effective. We set a limit. And also we create a real commercial space where the quotas can be allocated for consideration, so actually selling, or for free of charge, when the public authority decides that a company is taking a virtuous plan in the sustainable way. So a system that we support of mandatory emission trading is going to be very feasible. We just think about extending connection with already existing emission trading scheme, like the Chinese one. A global carbon tax would instead change the current economic balance because it would benefit countries like Brazil, Switzerland, and Ethiopia, and damage countries like USA, Japan, Italy, and Great Britain. So to facilitate negotiations, such an agreement, a cap and trade, must focus on a small number of large issuers. So in my speech, I demonstrate to you why the agreements are not possible. And our model is already used in Europe, and if integrated with a banking and border carbon tax system, as the second speaker is going to present, is more feasible and doable. So that's why I'm glad that I oppose this motion. Thank you, everybody.
Judges, as we have already stated from the speech of our first speaker of our proposition team, the global carbon tax issue is extremely relevant to the issues that the climate change crisis is bringing to our modern day society. Now, we would like to remind the fact that the carbon tax would focus on the reduction of the consumption of fossil fuels, which means that subsequently it would reduce pollution, thus reaching faster, as we demonstrated in our first argument, the goals of COP26 and COP27. So firstly, we would like to state that the International Monetary Fund IMF experts in 2022 demonstrated how international carbon pricing, especially through a global tax, has a greater potential to reach the goal established by the Paris Agreement. So in response to the opposition team, which has said that the Paris Agreement goals were the case. So additionally, something that we have to take into consideration is the fact that we have presented the WTO. Now, this means that we are not allowing for the United Nations states who have the right to veto to actually impose that they do not want the global carbon tax to be approved, because it is extremely mandatory that it is approved now for all of the environmental issues that are happening in the world, and that also obviously compromise the economy. Now, the opposition team has spoken about the United Nations, but again, they have stated actually in one of their speeches that cap and trade does not require unanimity. Now, what does this make us understand? That clearly they are stating not all the countries have to comply. Well then, how would this model be efficient? This clearly means that it would not be global, whereas what we are suggesting as a proposition team is for a system to be global in order to actually reach the goals that we so desperately need in these times. Now, another factor is that we have mentioned the peer pressure. What this means is that the public relations and the public image of the countries would be affected would they decide not to adhere to a global carbon tax. This means that it is in the best interest of all the countries, in order to reach their best interest also from an economic standpoint, to adhere to the global carbon tax. And we will explain this in our second and third argument. Now, another factor to take into consideration is that we are the ones here who are actually considering the factor of avoiding monopoly. In fact, the cap and trade system actually allows for a process which is so damaging for the economy and for their own benefits. Now, what this means is that the countries who are more economically powerful would be able to detain all of this cap and sell.
Okay, so are you aware that in Europe the system of cap and trade is they can just manage how they want, so it's working in Europe, why would not work, as you were saying?
We are considering is global. So taking into consideration a single continent would actually be quite inaccurate, because the fact that it has maybe worked in some senses in Europe does not necessarily mean it would work for the cap and trade system does not help developing countries, as the first speaker of my team has already stated. Now, this is because if we, as we said, there would be this monopolic condition created by the more important countries, what would happen subsequently is that the developing countries, if they wanted to purchase this cap, would have to pass it through the bigger, more powerful countries. So what this means is that the developing countries would be put in a condition of economic disparity, not to mention social injustice. Now, this is clearly something that as a proposition team, we do not want to support. This will create a static economy, no thank you, and thus we would not even be moving forward, not only from a pollution point of view, but also from an economic point of view. Now, I would like to introduce our second argument. So, introducing a second argument, we have to focus on what the actual objective of a global carbon tax is, and that is exactly of reducing the waste and the pollution that is in our environment. Now, a global carbon tax would lead to investment in green technologies. This is because we agree with experts like Eric Toder from the Urban Institute when they say it actually isn't enough to just raise carbon prices to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It is needed that we make serious investments in greener technology. Now, according to our model for a global carbon tax, the revenue obtained from this tax would be used under direct control of the WTO competent office for investments in green technology. So this system would work almost as if it were a wallet. Now, let us imagine that the WTO has a certain section of economic amounts that they can distribute among specifically the developing countries. This would be extremely beneficial because it means that the developing countries, as we have also explained before, will be able to invest in greener technologies, thus bringing their economic to a more equal condition in the modern society, and additionally bringing more social justice. And obviously, the more important goal, which is the reduction of pollution. Now, with a similar mechanism, the revenue obtained from the carbon tax, as we stated, will be redistributed. So what this means is that we will have a more transparent and a greener use of technologies altogether. So our model, we have proved to you, is realistically efficient, transparent, and targeted towards a greener future. We then have our third argument, which is that of the persuasion domino effect that would actually be created by the introduction of a global carbon tax, something that does not happen with the cap and trade system. Because the cap and trade system does regard the market, but it does not actually regard the political point of view of everything. Because there are consequences when we see countries, companies, and individuals who will be persuaded to think green. What this means is that we would be promoting a sensibilization of the population overall, and specifically of the bigger companies, to be more aware of how they are spending their money in the economy and how this is affecting every single human being on this earth. Now, having stated this, emitters of carbon dioxide produce a negative externality. What this means is that it is a cost to society itself. Why would society actually view positively a country that decides to ignore a global carbon tax, putting not only their own economy, but also the entire world gravely at risk? So, according to Forbes and Harvard Business Review, companies who go green are perceived by consumers as being more trustworthy. So, in the long run, companies have everything to gain. Likewise, governments will be persuaded to adhere to this global carbon tax specifically because of their public image, not only in relation to other governments, because the virtuous ones would definitely frown on the non-virtuous ones, putting public relations at risk, but also in relation to their own people, who would lose trust in their leaders if they are considered part of the climate change problem, especially considering the fact that there are already Fridays for Future and fights for environmental justice every single day. So how could we believe that not adhering to a global carbon tax would not lead to even more political dissatisfaction within the society? So people themselves will be persuaded by the green awareness. And we also have a survey conducted in the US, which indicates that 75% of Republicans under the age of 40 are in favor of putting a price in carbon production. This actually leads us to believe that they would protest against their government in case of non-compliance. And this is simply not the society that the proposition team is suggesting to you. So thinking greener, thinking for the best thing for the people, this is what the side proposition wants. And for this reason, I am so proud to propose. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition team, dear judges, audience. Good morning, everybody. My name is Benetta Fontana Rosa. Today, I'll start my speech talking about and refuting what other team has said, and then I'm going to pass to my two main arguments. So, first of all, as the first argumentation, the proposition team brought the fact that countries would apply a global carbon tax would actually benefit from the company's point of view and also from the population. But we believe that the population would not benefit from this situation because you didn't consider the social justice within a population, because the price of a product that increase cannot be afforded by the whole population. Then, talking about companies, you brought as the other team brought as their main points also the leakage problems. But applying a carbon tax that they didn't even bring us a level of the carbon tax. So they didn't say if the level would be, the rate would be the same in all countries or would be progressive and would be different. And even if it was different, so it would not affect all countries at the same time, this would lead to what they brought as a problem, so the localization. If my production in a country costs me more, for carbon tax, I'll go producing in another country. And this is a problem. Then, as a refutation, the other team brought the fact that not all countries have to participate in our model, but we have a data. If an agreement between China, EU, India, and US, so the most important global economies, would cover about 65% of global emissions. And you didn't even, about this point, we maybe did not bring a model that would include everyone, but they didn't demonstrate us how their model would be supported by the whole world. First of all, because we are talking about World Trade Organization and not an international organization between all countries from all the world. And they didn't even bring us proves that countries that are developing right now would introduce a global carbon tax of their products that would, in a way, limit their production. Then they also told us that in our model, most powerful will have more power, most powerful nation will have more power because they will have more caps. Yes.
Do you realize that with globality, we would have totally blocking carbon leakage as we have demonstrated in our first speech?
You didn't tell us if the rate level, they didn't tell us if the rate level is global, so it's the same. So if I said before, in a country, my production costs more, I will delocalize it in another part in which the rate is lower. Then I wanted to underline that our model, the caps are not traded within countries, but in the states. As their second argumentation, they brought the fact that reduce the emissions and it benefits the environment. But first of all, what is the thing? What brings really countries in putting a carbon tax that limits their production? They didn't resolve these problems. And second of all, we're going to see with my argumentations, my argument, that the net zero could be achieve in a more effective way with our model and not with their, because in our model we have a tax. No, thank you. We have a instrument on quantity of emission, not on their price. Last of all, they brought us the third argument, the domino effect. But as we will see, the population do not benefit from their model. Now, moving on to my two main arguments. First of all, the implementation of taxation system is not sustainable for many nation economies in the impact on taxpayers, in number and social acceptability, unlike a cap-and-trade system that is more feasible and effective of climate justice. So to make global carbon tax, companies and nations have to organize, first of all, and make a lot of decisions. The level of the rate, upstream or downstream tax, and the rate level that could be dictated by budgetary reasons for each nation that are different. Then, even if the rate was decided, then it could be wrong for the economic change that could need periodic optimization. But an optimization in a country is different from the optimization in another country. So in a cap-and-trade system, we minimize the numbers of political decisions that leaves actuators free to implement organization obligations and in the period of time that they want. No, thank you. Second point is the fact that they brought as an example British Columbia. But this is the example that in some places, such as British Columbia, the carbon tax is accepted. But in other places, such Australia, USA, Chile, France, Chile, we saw that the population revolted against the governments on this carbon tax. So it is not socially accepted by all the social conditions in our world. Third point, climate justice. You told that their model with a global carbon tax would bring to climate justice. But it's not true, because as the French economist, said, Piketty, in emerging countries, emissions from production activities exceed the emissions from consumption. So developing countries who produce more than what consumes would be more affected by a global carbon tax. So now moving on to my third argument. the application of a global carbon tax doesn't set certain emission targets, starting point of carbon trade. As I said before, I'm going to retake their third argument. They say that it would benefit the environment. No, thank you. But it is not true. Because, first of all, we have seen that with a carbon tax, there is a price that is established. So no one touches it. Capital is established by calculation, and no one can touch it. And this calculation can allow us to reach the net zero because of a mathematical calculation. While with the carbon tax, we do not ensure. No, thank you. We do not ensure that the demand of the products that have a carbon tax will decrease. First of all, because the energy demand, for example, is inelastic. So in a short term, consumers won't immediately change their energetic habits. So we need a solution in the short term. And in their model, it is not possible. So this cap and trade is already existing, and limits such as quotas that cannot be reused for future use are resolved by banking. So the possibility of accumulating credits, and issues such as the protection of national internal economies is resolved by the border carbon pricing that apply correcting pricing to imports based on their carbon content. So I've demonstrated you that with the global carbon tax is impossible to coordinate as a system. It would not be supported by the population and create climate injustice. And cap and trade is more efficient to reach the net zero. That's why I'm so glad to oppose to this motion. Thank you for your attention.
Then we continue with the debate. The speech was 8 minutes and 16 seconds long.
Okay, dear judges, first of all, I would like to structure my speech into two main spheres of discussion. That will be efficiency on the one hand, and on the other hand, pragmatism. In fact, with this structure, I'm going to rebuild and rebut at the same time. For efficiency, I would like to start about the fact that most responses of various carbon tax have been fragmented, dear judges, incremental and confined to a specific sector of the economy. And a lot of them are unequally distributed across regions and vary in their effectiveness. A global carbon tax, on the other hand, as we have already stated, would shift away from this problem of bottom-up approach. So, introducing a global carbon tax levied globally. So, the ecological market, the cap and trade system is not creating an ecological market, but just a new method for the biggest economy to create monopolies. In fact, they are limiting with monopolies competitiveness in the economic system, so the freedom of our economic system. This wouldn't help developing countries, but cap and trade can be just an excuse for the developed state to monopolize the economic system. Russia and China has postponed their limits, as the first opposition said, but on the other hand, with your cap and trade system, dear judges, they will be monopolizing our economy and the developing country economy. So, moving on, I would like to say that implementing a global carbon tax means avoiding a carbon leakage because the tax will be the same everywhere. So, in our world, a global carbon tax will be implemented in this way, conversely to the developing countries, because the economics of the developing country, conversely to what the other team has stated, we have proposed a model in which the developing countries, in order to promote their economy and in order to develop in a better way than they are actually doing now, they will not suffer from this global tax as the biggest countries, because they will have to develop their economy. And with the cap and trade system, they will just be monopolized, while with our system, dear judges, we are really protecting their economy. So we have stated that the problem that was brought to the second speaker was already. Another important point of efficiency is competitiveness that would force countries to take part in the global market, because as the first speaker of our team said, we are all on the same boat. So competitiveness will shift the renewable energy that will be more affordable, and our model is conversely to the other model that is avoiding competitiveness, promoting it, dear judges. So I would like to quote an example for the penalties that would be the public shame. In fact, in COP26, for example, prominent world leaders have publicly shamed nations that have failed, dear judges, to clearly state their strategies or have not been ambitious enough. So public image. Yes, accept.
Is this public shame is going to make these countries change actually in a short term?
Yeah, because the public shame implies that a big country that doesn't apply the carbon market, and our carbon market, so the global carbon market, is imposed by the WTO, will be imposed by this trading system. And if someone doesn't apply it, there will be public shame on that, because concluding my evidence, public image and possible damage to the public relation a powerful tool that can force country, dear judges, to comply with a global carbon tax strategy. So with the biggest country and a new monopolizing economy. So another important aspect is the time factor. In fact, with the fact that we are implementing the cap and trade system with the UN that has the right of veto, or for the fact that we are not sure if every country will apply the cap and trade system, dear judges, how could we be sure that the zero emission will be pursued?
Yeah.
Denied. So then moving on, I would like to start my second point of discussion and my second sphere of discussion, that is pragmatism. In fact, if a tax is set high enough, it makes polluting fuel, products and services more expensive than cleaner technologies. Therefore, emitters are strongly incentivized to reduce the level of emission and to alternatives that may lower impacts on the environment. So we are making the real ecological shift. And to do that, dear judges, we must impose the global carbon tax with the WTO. That is a real organization that can deal with the fact that this tax will be implemented. Because the World Trade Organization, an organization that comprehends a lot of states and maybe 126 states, and the states that are not in are just dealing with it. So in our model, the WTO is actually not complaining about the time factor, because the WTO is imposing the tax. In fact, dear judges, without imposing the tax, but maybe just with the cap and trade system, try to convince with the UN, because that's what the UN does, this system. How could it be possible to levelize until the zero level emissions? So our team takes into consideration the developing countries. So the global carbon tax will force, in fact, developing countries to already develop an ecological way system without making them lose money that will be spent on system and energy system that will not be possible to be sustained in the future, because our world has no time anymore, and in order to do that we must imply and with the WTO this global carbon tax. So then I would like to end saying that the global carbon tax is lower in these countries because they are not responsible for the mass of the pollution energy. So they will be helped with the distribution of money. The developing countries will just be manipulated by the bigger states, and dear judges, we want to avoid it. And for this reason, I'm so proud to propose.
My speech is going to start in 3, 2, 1. Environment hasn't won yet against economy, and public shame would. Dear judges, audience, opposition team, I'm Greta Civilla, and today I'm going to show you why the model proposed by the proposition team is rather utopic, while our model is effective and applicable. First of all, I'd like to start by saying that the World Trade Organization doesn't include all the countries, and so we can't impose the tax globally to all countries. What will be the problem? Linkage, because the countries that do not have the carbon tax will be cheaper, and so companies will go to those countries. Because we have said it also difficult to apply it within the states of the UN because there's not unanimity. We have showed you that through the COP26 or the Paris Agreement, there are many states that do not agree about the loss and damage. We haven't found a solution, and many states do not want to pay. They have, for example, India, basically said that they will arrive to net zero by 2070, and we do not have the time. How do they solve the problem of unanimity? They said that they said, first of all, that the tax will be equal for all. Then they said for some countries will be lower. I can imagine that they are referring to the, yes?
So when we stated that the tax would be equal for all, exactly what we meant is that it would be just for developing countries. How do you reply to this?
They said this will be equal to whole because we will make investments on developing countries in order to help them, because equality is reached through this by helping those countries that are poorer. And I answer to that, and I quote, "If we outweigh any other cost for developing country, and so we reach fiscal neutrality, how could the tax be effective? If we reach fiscal neutrality, we won't have an increase in the cost. We won't have effective taxation. And even so, talking about unanimity, we proposed the problem that the countries will have to decide the taxable amount. They will have to decide the tax rates. They haven't decided. They haven't said, for example, we will have $50 per ton of CO2, 75, nor said it will be progressive or not. Well, I can try to answer to you saying that it should be progressive because the energy demand is not elastic. Companies would have basically to try to make the transition to a more sustainable economy, and so it should start from a lower price. And I answer to you, if we start from a lower price, no thank you, then what will be the problem? That we will reach the reduction in global emissions in a long term. And we cannot afford that. We have a critical situation. We're in a fragile environment, and posing a caps on the emission will assure that we reduces them. And here we come to the politics. They said, first of all, no thank you, that our model is not global. And then I will try to answer to that by reading our model again. We said we propose a counter model of an integrated and hybrid system which starts from the effectiveness demonstrated by the European trading system. But our aim is to progressive integration of cap and trade systems under the aegis of a global permit market. No, thank you. And so, if you are utopic because you're not saying why the countries should agree on signing this global carbon tax, because it's not convenient for, there are also many frictions between countries, for example, between the USA and China or India that do not want to pay for the pollution. Then, how do you think that they will come to an agreement, such a global agreement? No, thank you. And for this reason, for our model that require no political accord, but within each state, because we say caps are established within the state, and companies within the state, as happens in Europe, can have these permits market. So there won't be political accords on a global scale. No, thank you. This is much more effective because considers everyone's interests. Then, arriving to another problem that is a social justice, the other team has not considered one thing, that the tax won't be accepted by the people. They said the majority of the people in the countries will accept this tax. And well, I bring you the example of France, the Gilets movement, that won't accept the tax, or Australia, that had tried to implement the tax, failed, and citizens do not want to do that anymore. So how do you make sure that the citizens will accept that tax, because you haven't considered the low-income citizens, yes?
Considering the fact that the global carbon tax would be beneficial to the citizens because it is reducing the pollution in the environment, how could you state this?
Yes, it will absolutely reduce the pollution in the environment, but what about economy? Will they pay for higher price of products just for the environment? I think that we are rather utopic thinking about that. And with our model, there won't be any monopoly, and we'll also help citizens, because in the European Union, there is a trading system, but not all citizens, no thank you, is affected by that. And so, in Europe, it has no weight on citizens, while in their model, citizens are not considered at all, especially the poorer ones. And then, talking about the pollution, they said the CO2, the system of global taxation is rather more efficient in reducing pollution. Well, I answered to you, because our model that establishes a cap that can also, no thank you, that can also be, for example, there are already carbon basically carbon footprints that say that you have to emit a certain amount of carbon if you want to reduce the temperature of a certain number. So there are these numbers, and if you do that, you will be assured that the pollution, the CO2 emissions will be reduced. But while with your model that maybe is efficient, but in a long term that we don't have, we won't have the same thing. So for this reason, we showed that a global carbon tax is a solution impossible to apply in the short term and for the diversity of conditions and interests of partners in international climate agreements. It is not sustainable for many national economies, and also developed countries won't accept to do it. And it is ineffective with respect to cost-benefit analysis and functionally towards the zero emission targets. And for this reason, our model that considers everyone's interests and thinks about everybody is much more applicable and efficient. Thank you.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Preposition team, dear judges, audience. Today we have debated about the motion. This house would introduce a global carbon tax. I would like to start my speech by resuming what are the main points of clash that we had during this debate. First point of clash, effectiveness on the population. On the model of the application of the global carbon tax, they ensure us, as the proposition, as the team, that the consumers will will increase the demand environmentally friendly products because they will buy those products with a carbon tax. But we responded saying that nowadays carbon tax is applied in some countries and population has already revolted. Then second point of clash, the effectiveness for the states. They propose a model in which each state has to put a carbon tax individually. And this carbon tax, they didn't understand, they didn't bring us the motivation for which each country should do that. And then they didn't resolve the problems that we have brought to them. There is delocalization and then social injustice. Last point of clash is the reduction of emissions. On their side, they say that a global carbon tax would actually decrease the use of CO2 emission products. But we've demonstrated that the demand is inelastic, and with our model, the net zero is achieved. So now moving on, I would like to present to you the two main wars that would be created following the two main paths. On the other side, we find the application of global carbon tax. They found the wrong solution to an issue that can't be resolved in a bad way, because we all recognize the problems with emissions and that we are near to a non-returning point. But their solution is not efficient. Why? Because the World Trade Organization is not the whole world. So nations then wouldn't have a motivation to join this agreement, and then because it would bring to delocalization. Then another issue in the world is the population that would not follow in many occasions the decisions of their governments, revolting against them. And then the net zero is not ensured, as we see in our model. Climate justice is not even taken into consideration, as we demonstrated with our argumentations. On the other side, we find our model, our world, in which we have cap and trade hybrid system, in which each nation put a cap to emissions, makes and then trades permits to emission within the country. So this would resolve the problem that different economies has to make different choices because of the economic situation, because the decisions that have to be made with cap and trade are less than the ones that have to be made with a global carbon tax. Then social justice is ensured. The net zero is reached because of many calculations that are made about the cap and trade, and the national economy is protected by the global carbon pricing. So in our model, no one is disadvantages. Why? Because it is efficient and considers everyone's interest. And that's why we should not introduce a global carbon. Thank you for your attention.
The grave risk on human life. This is what we are considering in today's debate, dear judges, because we live in a world where we understand that there is a climate crisis. We understand that pollution is a real problem, and we cannot allow for the economic comprehension of the world overly dominate on this aspect because really economy, yes, is obviously important in our modern world, but human life comes before everything else. Now, in the proposition team's world, we have suggested a global carbon tax, which we repeat would work purposely because it is global, thus it would ensure unanimity, because it is efficient and pragmatic, because of the time factor. How long would we have to wait for the cap and trade system to be socially accepted by the countries and to be implemented in their market mindset? How long would we have to wait to achieve this net zero goal? We simply do not have the time anymore. Additionally, we are actually promoting the economy, if anything. So not only are we providing environmental justice, which is the main objective of the global carbon tax, we're also providing you with this promotion of economy in which there would not be a risk of monopoly. There would not be a risk of more powerful countries gaining control over the other developing countries that, as we proved throughout this debate, are actually supported, if anything, by the global carbon tax. Now, the most important thing to keep in mind is that the tax would be socially accepted because the population would be greatly benefited from it. Holding these companies liable for the pollution that they have caused in the environment is something that people strongly feel close to their heart. Why is this? Because it regards the very possibility of the preservation of their life on this earth. Side opposition has talked about a situation with the cap and trade market, which would essentially produce unequal economic distribution, which instead proposition team has clearly solved. This is because an inevitable monopoly would take place through the bigger companies feeling extremely inclined to purchase all of the cap and thus selling it. We must also remember the fact that it was not specified how much this cap would be. So it is not clear from the counter model how this would actually even function with a unanimous decision. Now, the elimination of competitiveness obviously would lead to a static economy. Not only would it be morally unjust in the regards of the developing countries, but it would be economically unfair. Now, something that we have to take into consideration is that the WTO is the most inclusive because it is efficient and because it has the most amount of countries who would actually comply. The United Nations is not the best example. Why is this? Simply because countries have the right to veto. They can decide, let's say China decides not to comply with the cap and trade system. As a consequence, what would happen is that the cap and trade system would not actually work. It is not global, and it does not actually solve pollution in every area of this earth. So the UN, not including all of the states, is based on a suggestion essentially, whereas a tax would be an imposition because we must remember that we really do not have the time to wait for the cap and trade market to monopolize the world and supposedly reach the net zero goal. Now, the last question that I would like to ask is, would you rather fight for justice in the name of a corrupt, monopoly benefiting system, or fight for the direct affected of this cause, human beings? Thank you.
Ok, grazie ragazzi, ed ancora un applauso per lo sforzo. Adesso sono più tranquille, adesso sono più tranquilli, credo. Allora, adesso, mentre loro cominciano a elaborare i loro giudizi, noi dobbiamo fare una cosa, andare a premiare il... Ah sì, scusate, stavo dimenticando, dobbiamo chiudere la diretta streaming per il momento, ovviamente, e poi andiamo avanti a fare le premiazioni. Quindi fermiamo la diretta streaming e naturalmente ringraziamo le due squadre che hanno dibattuto. Tutti sognano adesso di poter vincere e auguriamo a entrambi di vincere. Quindi fermiamo la diretta streaming che riprenderemo poi con il dibattito in lingua italiana.